So, roots and wings, and what I wanted to start with, for those that have seen 2012, was a debate that's really, where does sustainability stray into comedy, and do we know what sustainability means at all? So I'd urge you, if you haven't been onto iPlayer, to go have a look at 2012, which is a take on the Olympics and how paid professionals are being asked to look at sustainability and at legacy, and where does sustainable development thinking fit within major multi-billion-pound operations. Some of that as a starting point. I suppose the other bit for me, which is really interesting, is today the Worldwide Fund for Nature brought out their Living Planet report, and that sort of chimes with the theme that it says we're consuming 50% more resource than we can deal with as a planet, and actually the whole notion of needing 3 planets for the population that we've got kicks in. So there's a wealth of material being released today about that. And the other one, I won't name the state or the country, but actually I've just seen a formal political agreement that bans a particular part of the world from having anything to do with sustainable development whatsoever, and from not funding sustainable development whatsoever. So hopefully in the next few minutes what you get is a little taster to help you think about what sustainability is. Some of it's going to be very much in black and white, so what I'm hoping for you to do is shade it grey and maybe also do some rainbow colours and say this black and white is how Jamie's put it across, just to get your taste buds going tonight, really. So part of that is, what is sustainable anyway? Who uses the word? How often do we use it? How is it associated with growth? Is it just about being viable? Is it about long-lasting regeneration? And actually, is most of sustainable development actually about reducing unsustainability? So are we coming at it probably from the wrong end, and where does that leave us? So the next stage was really, how do we think about sustainability? How can I use this first little spell to go, actually, let's have a common understanding of what sustainability was all about in the first place. John Ehrenfeld talks about sustainability being the possibility that humans and other life will flourish on Earth forever. Now that one can be contrasted with NASA's, which is a sustainability mission, which is to ensure the eternal human within the universe. So most of NASA's sustainability work is about spreading humans throughout the universe, and that means their view of sustainability is completely different than most government policy on sustainable development any of us have to implement. And really, the UNESCO and the United Nations touched on this in a separate document in 1997, which was really, do we stop and pause and think about our responsibility to future generations? And actually that's what sustainability was all about, right back to Agenda 21 and Brundtland before that. So there's an organisation I've been indirectly involved with, which I just wanted to flag up for you today, which is called the Alliance for Future Generations, formed last autumn, doing some really interesting research to see what is the level of public opinion and public policy about future generations. How much can we stop and pause and think about our responsibilities? And equally, what they've been finding is, if you give people the time and space, actually some of this long-term thinking isn't squeezed out, it isn't ignored, it's actually just part and parcel of everyday conversations. And particularly they're looking at a whole load of work to bring long-termism and the need of future generations, particularly into the political debate in the United Kingdom. So a lot of this debate for me is how do we deal with the sorts of problems that we're dealing with in the United Kingdom and across the world at the moment, around austerity, around environmental challenges, dealing with being rooted right here, right now, in places that we've never been before. So some of this is unprecedented times. We're seeing hundreds of millions of pounds coming out of local economies from the public spending settlements. We're seeing major changes in the way that private sector operate. We're seeing major challenges around household incomes. And then people like me turn up and say, oh, by the way, can we think about the next 100 years, please? And that's a mismatch that somehow we've got to bridge that gap between where we are in the big here that Brian Eno describes to challenging us to think about the long now and our responsibility. And for me, linked to that is, how do we link the past to futures, not just our preferable future, but actually the sorts of futures we might face if we are facing a planet of 9 billion people by 2050. Some of this means all bets are off and we have to think completely differently than we've done before. And I was chatting just before that some of this also comes at a change in policy time, where you've got changes around the nature of the permissive state. We're free, we can do things that we've never been able to do before. Also much more pressure on us to be much more responsible. So if we aren't going to be as heavily regulated, if there's going to be greater freedoms, how do we show the vast majority of us can be responsible, not just to ourselves and our own lives and our families, but to future generations? And part of that, John Elkinger describes as moving from change as usual to business breakthrough. but equally Peter Block talks about this being a fundamental stewardship role for us. And so a lot of this ties with how do we become and how do we exhibit much greater responsibility? How do big organisations and small businesses develop corporate responsibility? How do we show civic responsibility? All of this is right at the heart of the debates about sustainability. And some of that means that the future exists now through what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and some of this is about using our imagination to think about the next 50 to 100 years as and when we can, because otherwise we get trapped in the logic that we've always had. So the last few slides really start to say, how do we balance that big red block of right here, right now, with enough space and time to be creative and imaginative to think about the years and decades and centuries to come? And actually that's probably where the real breakthrough for places and communities will come, because if we settle for what we've traditionally done, we'll get what we've traditionally got. So that's part of the challenge for us. We know that the government's chief scientific advisor has warned us that by 2030 there's a likely perfect storm. I don't want to rehearse much of this, but that's the context of we're evolving, but are we adapting? And that's part of a challenge for us in the sustainability world, and maybe it affects you in all sorts of different ways as well. We know that Sir Bob Watson talks about preparing for a 4-degree adaptation. That's not to say it's going to happen, but he says, have you thought about what it would be like to live in that sort of world? So that's a challenge to our sustainability. And again, there are people out there who are doing some really interesting work to spread that time horizon from this year, this week, this month, this decade, through to this century. And it's working at timescales that many of us don't get the luxury to do, really. There are some people, for instance, this one, which is some of the Arctic nations are getting together. They're seeing huge opportunities from climate change. They're seeing this as a brand new trade route over the top of the pole. They're looking at this really creatively. And you could say, well, that's their climate change issue. It's not about clean technology. It's not about greening the economy. This is about the strategic positioning of communities and places. And here are two friends of mine from California called Newton and Helen Harrison. I've used them before in talks, but I just wanted to touch on them this afternoon, really, partly because as artists what they're able to do is take sustainability and the ideas behind it and step outside of the here and now and present things in a different way. So here are some images from a work that they did for Defra, looking at climate change and looking at what would happen if, as a small island surrounded by water, seas started to rise. Could we imaginatively think through what our places and our communities could be like? And what they started to look at is how might you develop a new future for the Pennine Uplands? How might you look at existing landscapes and existing land management and at existing lifestyles and start to change those through the next 20, 30, 40 years? And that's a whole different set of behaviours and skills that maybe we're not talking about in terms of sustainable development. And they got as far as working with some students from the University of Sheffield and a couple of the local communities to start to do some really interesting design work about legacy, really. What would our legacy be if we do sustainability creatively and leave something not just less bad, but life-enhancing for future generations? So this was a lot of the work that they did and is available on their site. And what they were starting to look at was a new way of dealing with landscape, a new way of dealing with lifestyles, and working through, if you like, this final notion that maybe in the north of England we've got some assets and some resources that we don't often stand back and look at, mainly because we're predominantly urban, mainly because we live in towns and villages, but actually it takes a chance to step back and look at scale at different ways of thinking about the sustainability challenge. So, from their point of view, and probably as a good way to finish this as anyway, the news is not good and it's getting worse, so yeah, that's okay, that's the sustainability story. But actually, we've got two choices. Either we can be transformed by these choices, or we can, together, transform the situation that we're in. So part of this, just to finish off, is saying there's a whole load of us who are potentially nomads. We don't really have roots anywhere, we don't really settle, we travel the globe, we're not rooted. There's a whole load of people who are in communities, living day in, day out with their lifestyles. They're really the settlers. And there's a whole load of us then who are the go-betweens. And maybe that's a way that we can think differently about sustainability. James Datta is a futurist from Hawaii. And one of the ways that he puts forward for thinking about a sustainable future is around these four general scenarios. One is, what if the world carries on the way it is? The one on the right-hand side is the disciplined society, which is, do we have to regulate and enforce behaviour change? And maybe other speakers will touch on that this afternoon. we have a chance to do some serious transformation, but it involves all of us thinking very differently and acting very differently. And what we might have to do is avoid a serious amount of collapse in the way that our systems and our societies are operating. So the final slide is really, there's a choice about how do we put down the roots into our places and our communities to make them that long-lasting, that 100-year, 1,000-year time horizon, but also how do we develop our wings to deal with imagination. Thank you very much indeed.